Welcome to The Second Cup, Conversations After the Podcast.
We want to welcome you to the Second Cup Conversation after the podcast. Today's guest is Casey Tygrett. Casey has been talking to us about his latest book on restlessness, so we're going to continue our conversation from episode 98. If you're listening to that, this is a follow-up to that episode of Common Ground Unity. Go back and listen if you haven't. You'll be blessed. But I'm going to ask Catherine Pimentel, who co-hosted that podcast with me, to go ahead and ask Casey the question to lead our conversation.
So, Casey, I know you've had a lot of experience with this idea of spiritual formation because you're a spiritual director and have been working in churches. But can you speak to the importance of spirituality and spiritual formation at this time within the church and this specific time in history?
Yeah. I mean, there's so much in that. It's such a good question. And I think it is asking it that's important, but I think it's also, for me, where I start with that is I feel like for so long, we have made spiritual formation a follow-up to the gospel, quote unquote. And it's something that you do. It's sort of like the hobby that you get to do once you're a part of, when you join the country club, you get to use the pool. And so spiritual formation is that. I honestly believe, and this influence comes from a lot of different places, not the least of which was Dallas Willard, which, by the way, if you listen to the other podcast, you realize I went an entire podcast without quoting Dallas Willard. I don't know what happened there, but it happened somehow. One of the things that I always felt Dallas was so good about was reminding us, and I'm paraphrasing from my own perspective, is that spiritual formation is the gospel. The good news is that
Absolutely.
we might be transformed, and how seeing Jesus through that lens changes things so much. Sometimes we get hung up on atonement and what happens after we die that we miss the fact that you need to be alive to be obedient to most, if not all, of what Jesus was teaching. You need to be in a body on earth with people in order to be obedient to what Jesus has taught for most of his life. And so I think the one thing that is most important is for churches to rediscover transformation is good news. And people are looking for transformation wherever they can find it. And more so than just stopping doing the things that are destructive, but finding ways, life-giving ways to conduct themselves in the world. So I think beginning there is really important. The other is the church is poised with another generation that really wants to be engaged culturally and wants to have a voice in things like politics, in things like our discussions around race and sexuality. And there's something to be said for knowledge. And I think the previous generation's answer to that engagement was apologetics. And I don't think there's anything wrong with apologetics. I have some friends who teach in that area and who are very strong proponents. But apologetics without character transformation is not helpful. And so until we're able to pair together a defense of why we have hope, I do like to come back to Peter on that. We're not defending the whole of the Orthodox faith. We're defending why we have hope, and pair that with an obvious, visible character transformation to where somebody can be like, I don't know if I even believe about Jesus, but something's up with you. Like, you're different and you don't act and respond the way other people do. What is that all about? That to me is why spiritual formation is so critical for churches and the church to have a presence in culture, in life, in whatever country they're in, moving forward. So recovering transformation is good news, and then also pairing culture or character transformation with cultural engagement in a strong way is really, really important.
I have a question about that, a follow-up question. I see this with our I've worked with teenagers for a very long time, and this generation is very different than the last generation. And what we are wondering how to navigate is a lot of kids want to perform their way into God's good graces. This is not a new thing, but I watch them do this to live out the gospel in a backwards way. And you're talking about how their life needs to reflect Christ. So when people see them, our culture responds to that and says, you're different. But I also am so aware of the fact that sometimes they think they can perform enough to be good enough for God. And instead of it coming out of a hope that they have in Christ and the hope that they have in Jesus and the hope that they have for the transformation through Christ, they're trying to earn his favor through their actions. So can you speak to that? How do we help people to work out of their hope in Christ instead of their, like you talked about, just that end goal of trying to earn heaven?
Yeah, I think there's a big piece of that rests on the culture of their faith community, the culture of the church the little C church that they grow up in. It is so easy to convey this idea of performative Christianity or performative discipleship, and there is something to the externals. There is something to living into it. I do think about like early Christian documents like the Didache, where they talk about people being a part of the Christian community for a year and living some of the practices before they are, baptized and made a part of the community. I think about that a lot, and how, these are people who are not even sure they believe what this is, but they're practicing into it. So I think on one level, there's part of that can be good, because it's more of a teaching, learning kind of moment. But allowing room for failure is probably the thing, and putting failure on display is probably the thing that helps most, because what I think is missing is that we don't make becoming like Christ compelling, and we also don't show that it is a work in progress. Their mentors are people who either are gifted at displaying a seemingly perfect life with Christ, and there's no transparency there. And so that passes on. Well, that person that I look up to, they're a perfect image of who Jesus is. And so all I need to do is look like that, and that will be fine. And I think the things you find happening, the good part of them living that way is that it will push them to the point of reckoning with their faith a lot faster, because there's only so long you can live in a performative kind of state. You'll either get exhausted or you'll get exposed. And one of those two things happens. And then if there's a community that's there to support them when that happens, and say, this is why you got to that point. It's more about presence than sticking close by those performative people, knowing that in the end, the outcomes of what they're doing might be good, but what's happening within them is the thing that matters most. And so some of that's teaching, some of it's presence, some of it's transparency from people who are in visible positions of leadership, and how we respond to when leaders fail as a community, I think is really important too. When we don't hold leaders accountable, and for when they're, I think about, the podcast about the rise and fall of Mars Hill. The one thing that stands out to me is that every time accountability was proposed, somebody said, well, what about the fruit? All that is praising performative Christianity. That's all it is. It's, I mean, did good things happen? Probably. And people's lives, I've met some people who were a part of the early Mars Hill days, and they were transformed. And yet that doesn't mean that accountability isn't necessary. And nothing will ruin a performative Christian faster than seeing I won't be held accountable as long as I perform well enough.
Well, it's such a performative culture in general, right?
Yeah.
People want the social media and who you are you can kind of craft this beautiful image of yourself and perform well enough to receive the accolades you need. And that's present in the church as well. And so it's
Yeah.
it's hard to navigate for all of us, I think. Those are some really good thoughts on that. I appreciate that.
Yeah.
Casey, let me ask you, for those that are listening who are church leaders, maybe they're in ministry, and they have been in a culture where church has been about programs and educational programs, and where our culture has been that we teach, we get information, and hopefully that somehow changes us. How do you move from that kind of a culture to one that is creating a healthy atmosphere for formation? I guess what I'm asking is, I grew up in a Restoration church, and we thought if you just teach the right things, people either accept them or they don't, and they either please God or they don't please God. In the end, you're in a good place with God. But it's about much more than that. It's about being transformed into the likeness of Christ.
Yeah.
What are some initial first steps to start moving in that direction of having healthy spaces in ministry that shapes people, helps them to be shaped into the image of Jesus? What would you recommend?
Yeah. Well, I think teaching is still important. So I won't walk away from that. I think teaching is important, especially teaching that emphasizes that not only is transformation possible, but that it's compelling, that it's the most interesting thing that we can do, that being like Jesus is more interesting than being like us. And when we teach that well and we make it compelling, it's interesting how sin becomes a little less interesting when becoming like Jesus is promoted and taught as something that's compelling and a way of life. So I don't think teaching teaching still needs to be a part of it. There's still a transformation of the mind aspect, but pairing that teaching with practice and reflection. If we can find a way to bring content and then it's the age-old question that we always had to answer about preaching is application. How do you apply this? With this, I think it's even more intense of how do we teach transformation? How do we give people a practice that they can use in the journey of transformation? And then how do we create a feedback or reflection loop? What was that like? Was it difficult? So I think, you talk about, for me, I teach a lot about compulsive behaviors, having struggled in the past with compulsions myself and addictions to pornography and things like that. I teach a lot on how do you transform this compulsive part of you. And so teaching a little bit on that, I talk a lot about fasting. I think fasting is one of the most powerful habits and practices we have when it comes to compulsions. And so all that I feel like is really great. But if I never say, and here's how you practice this, it doesn't have to be, getting into the nitty gritty, like it doesn't have to be food. And if it can be one meal a day, 1 day a week, 1 week a month, 1 month a year, you have some ways that you can practice that. If I never get to that, then transformation is going to be really difficult. And then if there's never a moment for them to come back and go, so I tried that stupid fasting thing you told me, and I just got hungry and angry. And for you to go, yeah, okay, that's fine. That's what should have happened. Not that you should be angry, but I want you to pay attention to that. Why were you angry? And then helping them to continue that. So I think it's the teaching, it's the content, but it's also bringing practice and reflection. And a lot of times our examples in churches of programs for Christian education or formation are modeled on scale. So they're modeled by churches that couldn't do that because of the sheer amount of people they're talking about. Getting creative in our local expressions is probably going to be huge for this. How do we do content practice and reflection with the people we have in the place that we have? And how do we commit to the long run? This is probably not something that you're going to do well in the next 6 months. It's going to take a while. It's going to be a grassroots kind of movement that starts that. One resource that I think is really good for that is my good friend James Bryan Smith. His books, The Good and Beautiful God, Good and Beautiful Life, and Good and Beautiful Community. They are fantastic at that content practice and reflection aspect. And so I'd love to see what would happen if a church took the time. It took a year, maybe 2 years, and committed to groups that practiced this, and just to see what would happen. So I think that's practically how we could begin moving from a Christian education only, because there's nothing wrong with Christian education, but what about formation and practice? That's also important.
Well, Casey, thank you so much. We appreciate this second cup that you have served up and offered to our listeners. So, again, want to encourage those that are listening to this to listen to episode 98 of the Common Grounds Unity podcast, and it'll frame a little bit more of what Casey's just shared here in this context. Thank you, Casey, for being with us.
Glad to be here. Pleasure. Thank you.